function, the local strategy function, is the actual implementation. And how is it that we're going to let Passport know that this user is good or no good, right? It's going to be implemented on top of our own function, right? That we wrote, last week, that checks to see if this username and password is good. Okay, it's going to be Passport's job to intercept the incoming login request, right? And parse out the username and password, and it's going to pass it to us right here. Okay, and we're going to use the just define user by credentials that we implemented last week, and I believe that one doesn't take an object; it takes an actual just username and password like this, not an object. It's just username and password. It depends how you implemented it for your assignment. So whatever you use for your assignment, then use your particular implementation of find user by credentials. Yes? Okay, mine is just takes username and password, I believe. So this is going to go out to the database. The database is going to come back either with a user object or null. If the user exists, right? Meaning if the user does not exist, it's going to execute this. If a user does exist, then it's going to execute this right here. Right? Now notice that our local strategy takes three arguments. See that? 3 arguments. Okay. The first argument, the first 2 arguments, obviously we understand username and password. The third argument, right? The third argument is a mechanism that Express provides that allows you to chain several requests together. To chain several functions that can handle the same exact request. Right? The request comes in right from the client, and it comes into and it's the first one to intercept that request is Express. Express parses out the cookies, parses out the body, parses out the parameters, the query parameters. It creates all these maps for you, right? And then it passes you the request object. Yes? Okay. Well, Express allows you to chain together several functions that allow you to break up the work into several little pieces, right? And then string them together, and then each one can pass the work along to the other, right? And the way it's done is typically by passing an additional function to you, where you can tell it whether you want to continue or don't want to continue, right? So anybody in the chain, right, can abort the request and say, no, I don't want to continue with the request. I just want to go back to the client. Because remember, meanwhile, the client is waiting for us, right? The request, as far as the client is concerned, is pending. Right? We haven't responded yet to the client. So the request is live. Anybody in the chain can make, manipulate the request, add to the request, remove from the request, parse more things, right? And anybody in the chain can abort the chain. Here, this local strategy is going to be used to intercept our login. All right, it's going to intercept our login, and the way it's going to intercept it is by us providing this login over here. We're going to instead of using, I believe this is what we're using right now. This find by credentials to be able to log in. I think this is what we're using right now, right? We're going to stop using this, and instead we're going to be using this alternative way of doing it. It's going to be API/assignment/login, all right? And notice that we're going to change it from a get, we're going to change it to a post. Okay, posts are more secure. One of the good things about posts is that before we were encoding the username and password in clear text in the query string, yes? Right? Post, at a minimum, allows us to grab the data, and instead of putting it in the URL, allows us to put us in the body. Right? So it would never be as part of the URL that somebody could just copy and paste it somewhere, right? The username and password would not be encoded in the URL. So that's at a minimum. In addition, we can encrypt the post. If you're using HTTPS, right, any information that leaves the client, right, will be encrypted all the way across to the other side of the server, and the server can then reconstitute the original message, right? And nobody in between would be able to know what the information was passed along. HTTPS, to be able to support HTTPS on Heroku, you need to change to a paid account. HTTPS is not provided to for the free account. So I'm not going to ask you to start paying on Heroku. So I'm not making it a requirement that you use HTTPS. All right, but if you would, right, if you change to the paid account from the client, the only change you need to do is that instead of using $HTTP to send information to the client, to the server, right, you just change to $HTTPS, and that's it. The information is then encrypted between the browser and the server. Right, the browser and the server are going to agree on keys, on public keys, and we're going to exchange all that and encrypt the data back and forth. Right, it's as easy as that. But I'm not going to require it because Heroku changed their policy, and to use HTTPS you have to change to a paid account. So I'm not going to require for the assignment. Okay, so yeah, so we're not going to use this anymore. You find user by credentials. Right? Instead, we're going to be using the post, right? From the Angular client, we're going to use a post, so login function is the one who's going to receive to see if the user has been logged in or not. Notice what we're doing here. Typically, notice that all these, right? We have the URL. You have the URL, and right after the URL, you have the function that handles that URL. Correct? Notice that this is a little bit different, right? Here's a function, and here's a URL. But notice that in between, we have something else, something new. See that? We're saying, hey, Passport, you handle this first. You take a look at this first, right? So intercept the communication, right? Intercede for us. Use the local strategy to look at the request that is coming, right? And you determine whether the user is logged in or not, right? This is a good login or not. And then notify us and let us know. Let us know whether this user is good or not, right? So what Passport is going to do is going to use our local strategy. There it is, right? Because we configured it. We said that the local strategy is this function right here. It's going to intercept if we do a post to this login, right? It's going to intercept the request. Is going to parse the username and password from the post, okay? It's going to pass it to us, and we're going to tell Passport again, say, hey, Passport, if there's no user, we're going to call the done function with a null and a false, okay? This says that there was no user, there was no error, there's no error per se, we just didn't find the user. The first argument to the done function is whether there was an error or not, right? And the second argument would be the user object, but there is no user object. We didn't find a user object in the database. So we're using the done function to notify Passport of our success or not of finding the user. If we pass in a false as a user, what Passport is going to do is going to abort the request. Is going to immediately turn around and send back an unauthorized, meaning, well, this user we didn't find it, right? They'll get I think it's a 401 or something, saying that this user is unauthorized, and we'll handle it on the client. If instead we did find the user, again, still the error is null. There's no error, but we're going to pass in the user that we did find. Okay, and what Passport is going to do is going to add the user to the session. So now the user that is currently logged in is permanently stored in the session. Anybody on the server side can always know who's currently logged in, right? And since it's in the session, you don't need to ever pass me any information. I know it's the same user. Well, until the cookie times out, right? Eventually, the cookie will time out, and then the session will no longer be valid. And then so this one right here represents our successful login. Right, and then we let the request go to the login function. Okay, and in the login function, the only thing left to do in the login function is not really much. by the time we get to the login function, we have already decided whether this user is good or not. Okay. Notice that if we return a false, right? If we return a false, we'll never get to the login function, right? Because passport is by passing a false here is going to interrupt the request and immediately send the response back a 4-1, okay, unauthorized. So it actually never gets to the login function, okay? Unless if we do a done and pass a user object, the user will be stored in the session, and when we get to the login function, the user will be already available for us, right? Actually in the request. So the current user object is now available to us in the request, right? It will be there as long as the server is running, as long as the session is valid, as long as it hasn't timed out, right? And then we're just going to respond back with the current user. That make sense? All right. All right. So one more thing. Is that we need to configure functions for Passport to how to interpret whatever we're storing in the cookie. Right. We need to decide what is it that we want to store in the cookie that we want to use to be able to reconstruct the user. Right. We need to store something in the cookie that once we get it back, we say, oh, it's that user. Right. So how do we map whatever we store in the cookie into to a particular user? So to do that, we configure two functions. One is going to allow us to store whatever we want in the cookie, or in the session, I should say. Right? Two functions. One is serialized user, and the other one is deserialized user. Right? These are hook functions that tell us, hey, Passport just received a request. It's trying to decode some information from the cookie, and now here's the cookie. I unpacked it. There's something in here that uniquely identifies the user. What do you want to use to identify the user in here? I don't know. What did you store in there? Was it the username? Was it the email? Was it the ID of the user? What is it? What are you using to uniquely identify this user? Passport doesn't know. We need to tell it. Okay? How is it that we're doing that? So these functions is for that. Also, so serialize allows us to put stuff in the cookie and send it back. And then when the cookie comes back, unwrap the cookie and reconstruct the user from that ID. Make sense? Right? And I have that here already implemented for you. And I'll put it somewhere down below. So in the serialize, this gets called whenever we send back a response. Every time we send back a response, right? Remember, cookies are being sent to the client. Every time the client generates a request, right? The cookies come from the client, and here we have it on the server side. Every time the server generates a response, the cookies go back, and everything is the headers, right? The headers are encoding all this information. So the serialize is our chance, right, to decide what to put in the cookie. And the way we do it is that, well, first of all, it passes us the user object. Here, the user for the currently logged in user. And here we're deciding that we want to put the entire user object in the cookie. All right? We don't need to store the entire user object. The ID would be plenty, right? Would be enough. As long as you're consistent, whatever you put in there, that's what you're going to get back, right? If we decide to put the user in the deserialize, this is what comes back in the cookie. For us, right, this is really an object, the original object that we have put in there, that we know it's the user object that we have put in there. We know that in there there's an ID in there, right? In there as well is going to be the password, the username, the email, all sorts of stuff in there that really is not needed on the client. But we don't mind sending it because anyway it's going to be encoded, right, and undecipherable on the client side anyway, right? It's going to be signed and encrypted by the server. Anyway, so we retrieve the user from the cookie. we use the ID that was initially stored in that user object, and then we use that to retrieve the user, reconstitute the user from the user ID. If we find the user from the database, then we do a done. We're notifying Passport saying, hey, we found the user. Here's the user from the database. The cookie was good. It does represent a valid user, and it is currently the currently logged in user. Otherwise, we don't find it. We're going to fail it and say, no, we never found this user. Somehow that ID doesn't match any of our IDs, right? Maybe the cookie was tampered with or something, right? We didn't find it, and we're going to fail it and say, no, we didn't find the user, and it's going to go back with a 401. Okay. Let's see what else. I think we're set on the server side. On the client side, we need to make some changes, right? Notice that we're going to no longer going to be using this to log in, right? Instead, we're going to be using this post to log in. See that? Right, so we need to change that on the client side as well. So let's go back to the client side. So on the client side, that would be on the user service. Let's see, user service. So on the client side, we want to now instead of using this find user by ID, I believe that's what we're using to log in, isn't it? Let's see the login controller. So the login controller, when we log in, there it is. When we log in, yeah, it's using user service find user by credentials. That's what it's using, correct? So instead, we're going to be creating in the user service a brand new endpoint. It'll be login. Okay, and we're going to be replacing this. We're going to be saying find user by credential. Instead of using this, we're going to be saying not this. We'll do login. Same username and password. Okay, we're going to be using that login and username and password. That login function is going to be there it is. Going to pass username and password. Username, password. And instead of being a get, it's this one right here, right? It's going to be using a post. So at least the username and password is not going to be encoded in the URL. So we're going to remove that from here. All right, and this is going to be login. So we're going to be posting to /API/assignment/login, and it's going to be a post. Plus, we need to pass the username and password, right? And we're going to do that in the body, right? So, so it's going to be var credentials. It's going to be an object of username and password. Username and password. So and we're going to send that over. We're going to send that over on the server side. That's going to be handled by this endpoint. See that? That endpoint is going to receive it, and that endpoint is going to be intercepted by our local strategy, right? So our local strategy is the one who's going to be responsible for parsing the username and password out of this credential object, out of this object that we're going to pass along, right? So we're going to pass the URL and the credentials. Right? It's going to pass the entire body, right? It's going to be this local strategy. Notice that we don't get the request and the response here. See that? Right? So that has been abstracted for us. It is going to be looking for an object in the body that have attributes username and password. So it's going to be looking for that in the request, right? It's going to extract it, right, and then it's going to pass it along over here. Okay. So let's see where we are. Let's put a breakpoint here and let's restart this. And let's try and hit this. So it'll be login, localhost. We'll go to assignment. We'll go undergraduate, index, login, inspect, network, and let's do Ken and Ken. I believe this is one of the users, Ken and Ken. Log in. So I went in here. Okay, so we're hitting the local strategy, right? And we have Ken and Ken. There it is. Let's put a breakpoint here, and let's continue. And let's see if it found the user. Hopefully, yeah, it found the user. Now because it found a user, it's going to return saying that yes, that user is a valid user, and hopefully it'll come here. There it is. So it made it into the login, and indeed the request that user is an object. It's going to respond back with the username and information with Kenneth and Ken. On the client side, we can look at the controller for this. Right, presumably right here, found, right there. So if we do a continue, there we are. On the client side, we have the user. There it is, Ken and Kenneth, right? So basically we haven't changed much, right? The only thing that we were able to introduce the fact is that now this user is in the session, right? So subsequent queries, right, there would be no necessary to encode the user in the URL, right? So we're gonna be able to remove the user ID from the URLs because now we have that stored in the session. We don't need to encode it in the URL, all right? And we'll do that tomorrow. Okay? All right. Awesome. Thank you.